Hi, everybody. Welcome to Evidence to Action 2021, Reimagining Development Aid. I'm Carson Cristiano. I'm the Executive Director of SIGA. For those who are newer to our work, the Center for Effective Global Action is a hub for research on global development, headquartered at the University of California in Berkeley, with faculty affiliates extending to nearly 20 campuses along the west coast of North America. We exist to help governments, NGOs, funders, and even social enterprises make better bets when it comes to poverty reduction. And we're motivated by the fact that development resources are often spent in ways that don't achieve policy goals or improve people's lives. Our researchers work very closely with partners and decision makers around the world, primarily in low and middle income countries, to come up with innovative solutions to poverty and rigorously test those solutions in the field. Reducing uncertainty about what works and what doesn't work and why is so critical when resources are scarce and people's lives are on the line. These are just a few things that set SIGA apart. We're innovative, meaning our researchers frequently use new types of data, new tools, and new analytical approaches to help answer important policy questions, especially in cases where traditional methods might be expensive or insufficient. We're inclusive, meaning we encourage diverse research collaborations, and we support the capacity development of low and middle income country scholars and partners. And we're transparent. SIGA research balances sensitivities around data privacy and publication timelines with a firm commitment to open science, so research transparency and reproducibility. Today marks our 12th annual Evidence to Action Symposium. Over the years, we've explored a range of diverse topics, including climate change, health data and measurement, the reality and future of work, technology for public good, and fintech for global development. I love this event because it's an opportunity for us to highlight and really celebrate the impacts that SIGA research is having around the world. This isn't a typical academic event, so our audience is a very nice mix of researchers, practitioners, decision makers, and funders. And while our talks will be shorter than they would be at a typical academic event, we really hope that you walk away feeling inspired to learn more. So I'm very excited about today's topic, which is reimagining aid, because it's so timely and also because it showcases a set of challenges that SIGA, I think, is uniquely positioned to address by leveraging new types of data, as well as strong interdisciplinary and cross-sector partnerships. So by aid, we mean social safety nets. So that could mean these are designed to protect households from falling into poverty, and also emergency aid, which includes in-kind or cash support intended to provide relief to those affected by a crisis. These types of programs are typically distributed by governments as well as NGOs to beneficiaries on very different scales and in different contexts. In fact, almost all countries in the world have some form of social safety net in place. This is one of the most widespread and powerful tools that governments have to protect vulnerable members of society. And with any anti-poverty program, there are a number of open questions about who to target with aid, what type of support to provide and at what time, and of course, how to provide it. So I want to acknowledge right now that there's a lot of research happening across the SIGA network and beyond on all of these topics, including very interesting work on the timing of transfers and even the potential for governments to use what's being called anticipatory aid. So how can we identify who needs aid before a crisis even strikes? And today's event is going to focus primarily on the who, and now I'm going to hand it over to SIGA Faculty Director Josh Blumenstock, who's going to tell you a bit more.
Great, thank you, Carson. So I thought I would take just a couple minutes to provide a bit of high-level framing and motivation for the focus of this symposium, which Carson nicely introduced, Reimagining Development Aid. And you look at the headlines, you look at these figures, and it's clear that now is an especially appropriate time to be thinking about the questions of humanitarian aid, particularly in light of the ongoing COVID pandemic, which has really accentuated the shortcomings of a lot of traditional approaches to delivering humanitarian relief, particularly in low and middle income countries. Because while COVID has been, devastating and disruptive everywhere, including in wealthy nations like the United States, The scale of the crisis has been particularly severe in low and middle income countries. And what's unique, or not unique, but again, exacerbated in these contexts, is that a lot of the public health interventions, the things like lockdowns and stay-at-home orders that are designed to stop the spread of the virus, also stop a lot of people from working. And when you remove the primary source of income from a household that's living below, close to subsistence levels already, that can leave, as we see again, hundreds of millions of vulnerable households without means of subsistence. And so what you see when you step back and look at the numbers and the chart here is that while over the last 20 years, we've been making steady progress in reducing global poverty, really just since the beginning of 2020, there's been a sharp uptick in extreme poverty, with estimates sort of ranging that from anywhere from 90 million to about 120 million new people living in extreme poverty who weren't at the beginning of the pandemic. So that's sort of the grim specter. On the flip side, there has been a massive humanitarian response to the COVID crisis. There's a great blog maintained by Ugo Gentilini at the World Bank that tracks these numbers. The most recent tally I saw said that there were over 3,300 new social assistance programs launched since 2020. And if you tally up all the numbers, there's over $1 trillion in cash payments going out to over 1.5 billion people. So that's over 1/5 of the global population. So this is a massive footprint of new humanitarian aid. And most of these programs, if not all of them, are targeted, and they involve some form of difficult decision-making on the part of the policymaker or the program designer that tries to answer this question: who should be eligible for the limited resources that exist? Because by and large, these programs don't have anywhere near the resources needed to do something like a universal basic income. So they're forced to make very tough decisions about who should be eligible and not, and who won't be eligible. And again, this eligibility targeting question is difficult in every country, and the United States government has gotten a lot of pushback for how they targeted the CARES Act. But if you look at a low and middle income country, and particularly in fragile states, the data that's available to policymakers to make these targeting decisions is often very out of date or unreliable. And so what this table is showing you is just how long it's been in a handful of countries since the last census-style data set was collected. And it's been decades in many countries. And what you see here, and I can cite some other numbers from recent papers, something like half of the poorest countries haven't conducted a census in the last 10 years, and more than a quarter of the world's children under 5 aren't registered at birth. And so this creates a dilemma for the governments or NGOs that are trying to respond to humanitarian crises about how to make those allocation decisions, given the limited data that are available. And so this is a theme that a lot of the presentations today will touch on, including the keynote speaker, Minister Lawson, who will be speaking in just a couple of minutes. And now, a lot of the focus in my remarks so far and in the global community has been on COVID response. But the COVID disaster, while very pronounced and anomalous, is just one prominent example of the types of shocks that are likely to become more and more commonplace at varying scales. With COP26 happening right now, and you'll see that the minister stepped aside from negotiations at COP26 to give some remarks for this event, we're reminded of the severity of climate change daily. And it's worth highlighting the implications for people living in poverty. So here's a quote from the World Bank, which says, unchecked climate change is expected to push 132 million people into poverty over the next 10 years, undoing hard-won development gains. Impacts are likely to be felt most by the most vulnerable population, including women, children, and refugees, and they're threatening to drive millions, hundreds of millions of people into leaving their home countries by 2050. So these are really global challenges, and they involve targeting not just for social protection programs, but also for a range of other benefits. Next slide, please. So I think one key theme that we're going to touch on, and several of these will come up in the next sessions is beyond cash targeting. So there are some sessions that focus on cash targeting, but we also can think of how targeting plays a role in things like targeting service offerings, like public health interventions, consumer credit, small business loans to entrepreneurs. Or you can think about targeting information that can help smallholder farmers make critical harvesting and planting decisions, how information can be targeted to community health workers and to people at the risk of severe weather events. And finally, and again, one of the next speakers will talk about this, things like targeting jobs and training, such as youth employment support or even cognitive behavioral therapy. And these are just a few examples of how this targeting question really weaves its way into a lot of fundamental social assistance and social protection programs that exist. And so we hope that today's talks will shed some light on the opportunities for innovation in the space and really cutting edge research that's going on in this area. And so I'll wrap up my remarks by just highlighting this quote from a recent op-ed by Sendhil Mullainathan, who asks, and so I'm going to swap in advertising because I think it's more relevant. So why should the advertising industry, where mere dollars are at stake, be using more advanced technologies than the aid industry, where human life is at stake? And I think this quote really gets the heart of what we're hoping to change and bring some attention to through this event. Because when you look around, there's a really fundamental misallocation of labor and capital. Literally billions of dollars are spent annually on advertising, and a lot of the smartest data scientists and smartest minds, not just in academia, but in industry, are working on this idea of how can we better target ads to people who are more likely to click on them and buy things. But really just a small sliver of attention is going to how can those same technologies and how can new innovations be used to better target aid and target humanitarian response. And so I think one of the points here is that there are really huge unexploited margins, big, ripe, low-hanging fruit that are there to adapt some of this billion-dollar investments in the advertising industry to these global challenges of poverty alleviation. So we have a great lineup of speakers that I'm really excited to hear from. They're going to be presenting ongoing and recent work that's shedding light on these topics. And I think I'm going to hand it back now to Carson, who will give a little bit more details on some of the speakers that are coming up. Thanks, Carson.
Thanks. So we're about to dive into a series of talks by SIGA researchers, collaborators, and partners who are each looking at this targeting aid question from a different angle and in a different context. So we're going to have 2 sessions of academic talks and then a panel featuring 3 individuals who are all really on the front lines of aid delivery, and they're going to share their experiences with us. We're going to save a little bit of time for questions at the end of each talk, and we really encourage you to type anything that comes up into the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and our moderator will do her best to help address them. Before we launch into our first panel, I'm really delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, who unfortunately can't be with us live this morning, but who generously sent over a recording of her remarks from Glasgow for us to include. So Sina Lawson is Minister of Digital Economy and Digital Transformation in Togo, which is this very small but mighty country. Minister Lawson has over 17 years of experience in telecommunications policy and regulation. She's now leading Togo through a profound transition to an inclusive digital economy. She's very quickly becoming a thought leader on this topic across the African continent. Lawson began her career at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., working with low and middle income country governments on regulatory reforms. Among her many ambitious projects as a minister, Lawson is strengthening data protection and cybersecurity in Togo. She's implementing a universal digital ID, digitizing public services and government-to-person payments, and accelerating the deployment of high-speed internet. So really impressive work. And the minister's work has gained recognition from all over the world, including from the World Economic Forum and Forbes. A couple of years ago, she received the Harvard Alumni Public Service Award. She's a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. We're very lucky to have Sina with us, at least in some form today. Just a note that 2 of the researchers, including Josh, who work very closely with Minister Lawson on the Novisi platform that she's going to talk about, are here with us. And so if you do have questions about her talk, there'll be opportunities. Go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and Emily Aiken and Josh can try to answer those questions as we go along. So Iman, go ahead and share our video. I don't hear the sound.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers at the Center for Effective Global Action for the opportunity to give the keynote speech at this year's Evidence to Action Symposium. I'm sorry I could not be physically present at Berkeley, as I am in Glasgow for COP26. The title of this year's event, Redesigning Development Aid, could not have been better chosen. According to the World Bank, about 9% of the world's population, approximately 690 million people, still live below the poverty line of $1.9 per day. While this number has been constantly declining over the last 2 decades, the COVID-19 pandemic interrupted this trend, pushing more than 120 million additional people into extreme poverty. On top of that, climate change-induced disasters, the rising number of conflicts and associated humanitarian crises around the world are likely to increase this number even further in the future. Against this background, providing social protection and tools like emergency aid programs become increasingly important to protect the most vulnerable individuals in our societies from being left behind. However, while powerful, social protection programs are often difficult to implement for governments due to a lack of reliable data and the associated difficulties to targeting, design, and delivery of these programs. In this context, I'm very pleased to be given the opportunity to share Togo's experience of how we tackled these challenges during the COVID-19 crisis through our fully digital emergency cash transfer program, Novici. While many countries found it difficult to identify, register, and pay millions in need due to social distancing measures, Togo managed to distribute $34 million to more than 920,000 poor people, which is 1/4 of its adult population, by leveraging digital means such as mobile technologies, non-traditional data sources, and machine learning. The Novici program came out of the urgent need not to leave anyone behind, as restrictive measures were put in place to fight the spread of the virus. You must know that Togo is a country in which more than 50% of the population still lives in extreme poverty, and about 80% of the population works in the informal sector, living on day-to-day jobs that cannot be done from home. Hence, it was imperative to support these individuals and their families who had lost or were at risk of losing their daily revenues. So what makes Novici unique? First, it is the speed of the rollout. The Novici program was launched on April 8, 2020, a week after the state of health emergency was declared by the president. The Novici platform was fully developed in-house and the system up and running in a mere 10 days. It was a 100% digital cash transfer program with no face-to-face contact from registration to assessment of eligibility and cash payment. Leveraging digital means throughout the process enabled a quick rollout of social assistance during the crisis. Second, it is the speed of cash delivery as payout were instant. People received cash transfers on their mobile money account in less than 2 minutes when declared eligible. Within 1 week after its launch, Novici was able to disburse social assistance to about 450,000 people. Such a fast cash delivery would have been difficult to achieve with traditional methods. Third, the platform is internet agnostic. The cash transfer platform did not require an internet connection for users to enroll and receive their payments. It used low-tech mobile technologies such as USSD. So people living in an area with no internet coverage and with basic 2G telephones could register by simply dialing the USSD shortcode *855 hashtag on their mobile phone to access a special menu. This was a strategic choice since the internet penetration in Togo is only about 62%, while mobile phone ownership is about 85% and 2G coverage is about 91%. Fourth, it leveraged non-traditional data sources and machine learning to improve the targeting of beneficiaries. This is a potential game changer for the delivery of social protection programs in countries that have limited social registries. During the first phase of Novici, eligibility was based on the applicant's locations and profession, so you needed to be an informal worker living in an area put under curfew. To verify the identity of people, we chose the voter ID as it was the most up-to-date and widespread biometric ID at the time the program was launched. On top of that, voters' ID database provided information on the location and professions of the card owner, which were the two main eligibility criteria at the launch of the program. However, soon after the launch of the Novici program, we started thinking about ways to efficiently target the limited public funds to the people who needed it the most in case the pandemic drags for long. One of the challenges we faced with the occupation-based targeting used in the early days of Novici in urban areas is the fact that it didn't translate well in rural areas where the majority of the poorest people lived. So in its second phase, Novici turned to innovative high-tech methods to improve targeting of the most vulnerable people. With the help of the Center for Effective Global Action here in Berkeley and IPA, we used satellite imagery to draw a poverty map of Togo and rank its districts from the poorest to the richest. Next, we leveraged mobile phone metadata analysis and machine learning to identify the poorest people living within these poorest districts. With the financial support of the US NGO Give Directly, we were able to test this pioneering targeting approach, distributing $10 million in cash transfers to 140,000 people. Early results indicate that the AI-powered targeting approach reduced exclusion errors by 4 to 21% compared to the categorical targeting approach used in Novici phase 1. Efforts are ongoing to further improve the machine learning algorithms through harmonized surveys of the population. So let me summarize the winning features of Novici. Its success story can be attributed to several key enablers, which taken together allowed for a speedy and robust rollout of the program in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Novici's success was facilitated by the existence of a reliable and up-to-date biometric population registry. As presidential elections took place in February 2020, voters were required to update their voter ID information as recently as December 2019 with the most important attributes like name, address, and professions. The Novici platform was developed in-house by leveraging existing technical capabilities and skills through trust and a common vision. Due to the urgency, there was no time to rely on external solutions or integrate new developers. At the same time, everyone within my team was driven by a strong sense of purpose to help millions of Togolese who urgently needed it. The process and design of Novici aimed to be inclusive and usable by focusing on mobile phones and mobile payments, which are used by most of the population. The popularity of mobile money and the collaboration with the country's two mobile money operators allowed for speedy scalability and played a role in the program's success since people did not have to travel far to cash out and use the funds. It guaranteed operational efficiency by eliminating transfer tariffs and allowed for the first payment to automatically open a mobile money account. Our deliberate effort to make governance transparent and accountable was also notable. The Novici platform had a log of every attempted and completed enrollment and all transactions with their status, successful, failed, pending. Payments made through the Novici platform and mobile money operators were reconciled daily by an independent auditing firm to ensure full traceability from source to destination. This increased trust and confidence by donors into the program. Furthermore, to secure public support, we set up a toll-free contact center which ran from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. daily to provide remote assistance and establish a feedback loop into the system. Finally, a dashboard provided key statistics on the number of registered people, the number of beneficiaries, their location, and professions to ensure transparency, particularly for donors. So what's next? Going forward, we intend to digitize all G2P payment, deliver digital ID to all citizens, and reinforce this data-driven approach. We also believe that there is a need to spread the word and encourage more governments to use big data and data analytics for better and more efficient responses to an ever-increasing humanitarian crisis. In this regard, countries should be proactive. They should first build a national digital payment infrastructure which can distribute cash to affected people immediately after a disaster. Indeed, sending cash directly to the extreme poor is one of the most proven and efficient ways to combat poverty. Second, countries must adopt a data-driven approach for better and efficient targeting. This would require the implementation of a data exchange platform within the various entities of a given country and the development of national data analytics capabilities. However, it is important to note that these infrastructures should be inclusive, meaning that everybody, or at least a vast majority of people, should be able to use them. This platform should also be transparent and fast to roll out. They should be protected from cyber attacks and, most importantly, be in line with the regulatory framework in terms of transparency. With that, I will leave it to Josh Blumenstock, who led the work for the development of the targeting algorithm, and Emily Aiken to share more details and findings from their research in Togo. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you fruitful discussions during the symposium. Thank you again.
So I'll thank Minister Lawson and her team in absentia for taking the time to remotely join this symposium. She has very important things to do right now. But I just wanted to briefly comment on the fact that, hopefully it came through in the talk, but the minister has been extremely innovative and resourceful in figuring out how the Togolese government can respond to the humanitarian crisis. And in addition, and this is, I think, one of the things that makes her and her team truly unique, is their openness to collaborating with researchers and her strong support for the research program, about which you'll hear about in a minute from Emily Aiken. And I think it's worth acknowledging that this was a big and potentially risky decision that she took, as there was no guarantee that the evaluation that we were conducting, which was scientifically objective, would turn up positive results. And you'll hear more on that in a minute. But I think Minister Lawson really recognized the importance of building this evidence base, this very nascent evidence base around what works and what doesn't. And looking forward, I think it's really critical that we find ways to support and develop more collaborations of this type. And I think we'll hear over the course of the day about some of the different models for this type of collaboration. As Carson mentioned, we're not going to have questions directly for Minister Lawson right now because she is in Glasgow. But we are going to hear from Emily Aiken in just a minute. And after Emily's presentation, which is about the same program that the minister was talking about, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, not just about the research findings, but broader questions about Minister Lawson's remarks, which Emily or I may or may not be able to respond to, depending on how much we know. Okay, I'm going to hand it over now to, I think, Christina, who's going to set up the next session. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Josh and Minister Lawson. So I'm excited to introduce our first set of academic talks. As Josh said, first up, we have Emily Aiken, who's a PhD student at the UC Berkeley School of Information. Emily applies computational methods to issues of economic development, global health, and sustainability. And as you heard from Minister Lawson, Emily has been a core member of the team developing and testing a machine learning-based targeting approach in Togo. So if you have questions for Emily or Josh, who's also here and can help answer them, please make sure to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Instead of raising your hand in the chat, please use the Q&A box, and we'll direct them to Emily after her presentation. So Emily, you can go ahead, please.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just quickly share my screen. Awesome. Well, as has already been introduced, my name is Emily. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I was lucky enough to be one member of the research team that worked with Minister Lawson and her team on the Novisi cash transfer program in Togo during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm one member of that team, but this is joint work with a whole bunch of awesome researchers, including Suzanne Bellou from the University of Mannheim, Dean Carlin and Chris Udry from Northwestern, and then Josh Blumenstock from Berkeley, SIGA faculty co-director and my PhD advisor. All right, so I'm gonna try to pick up basically exactly where Minister Lawson left off and provide more details about our specific work on targeting the Novisi program in rural parts of Togo. I'll start by providing just like one slide of context rather than going into too much detail, but I'll try to review some of the key points that Minister Lawson brought up. And then I'm going to talk in detail about how we selected the poorest geographies and poorest individuals for Novisi transfers in partnership with Minister Lawson's team. And then lastly, I'll talk about some other high-level considerations in using digital data for cash transfer targeting. All right, so I just wanted to review a few of the key points on Novisi before I jump into the details on the targeting work. As Minister Lawson mentioned, Novisi was launched in Togo in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly in response to this concern that Josh was expressing earlier that the types of lockdowns introduced before COVID also caused a lot of people to slip into poverty or prevented people from accessing their normal livelihoods. And so in response to that, Minister Lawson and her team designed the Novisi program, which was launched shortly after COVID actually reached Togo. Novisi was designed to be 100% digital. So people registered for the program by filling out a short text-based survey on their mobile phone. And then if they were deemed eligible, they received their payments via mobile money. So 100% contact-free. Eligible beneficiaries received between $12 and $22 per month. And that depended on both gender and then which Novisi program they were enrolled in. And then perhaps most importantly for our work, Novisi was originally launched in the cities of Togo where there were initial lockdowns for COVID-19. And then it was initially targeted towards informal workers living in those cities under the hypothesis that informal workers were both the most vulnerable and also likely the most affected by the curfews put in place. While that was like a pretty impressive feat in itself, a few months later, Minister Lawson and her team became interested in expanding Novisi into rural parts of the country where the poorest populations were known to be living. And that's how our collaboration was born. We started working together on thinking about how aid could be targeted in those rural parts of the country. The sort of key issue being that that informal worker targeting approach that was taken in the cities might not scale well into rural parts of the country because so much of the population in rural areas was just subsistence farming. Lastly, before I dive into the details, I just wanted to note this was a collaboration between our team and Minister Lawson's team, and then also NGO Give Directly, as Minister Lawson mentioned, who funded about $10 million worth of cash transfers for this program. All right, so now I'm going to talk in detail about our actual research work in terms of selecting beneficiaries. First, we selected poorest geographies in Togo to become eligible for NoVC aid based on using satellite imagery. And second, we selected the poorest individuals in those geographies using mobile phone data. All right, starting with the geographic targeting aspect. Once we started working with Minister Lawson and her team, it became clear that one of the priorities was to identify the poorest villages in the country in which to distribute aid. The challenge was that there was no comprehensive survey data available that could tell us which villages were the poorest in the country. In fact, there wasn't even survey data that was representative of poverty on the canton level, where cantons are admin 3 units in Togo, perhaps roughly equivalent to counties in the United States. This is actually not a super uncommon situation. As Josh mentioned early on, a recent study found that something like half of the poorest countries in the world don't have comprehensive up-to-date census-style data. And so that really highlights the challenge of targeting aid, or even just geographic targeting of aid, when there's not a lot of data available. Given this challenge, we turned to satellite imagery. And this was built off kind of a long body of research work that has shown that satellite imagery can be predictive of poverty. The intuition here is that satellite tiles contain a lot of information about really spatially granular poverty. So a satellite tile might cover just something like a 2 by 2 kilometer square, but for that square, you have all kinds of information encoded in that satellite photo. There's information about the quality of roof materials of houses in a village, information about road density and road quality. There's information about forest cover and access to water, and all this other really rich information that's related to poverty is in these images if we only were able to extract it. And that's where machine learning comes in. So machine learning at its core is really just a technology to extract patterns from underlying data. And in this case, we use supervised learning algorithms to extract those poverty patterns from the satellite imagery and produce sort of unidimensional poverty estimates, or estimates of consumption, for each satellite tile in Togo. And that's what I'm showing on the middle map on that screen, is these really granular estimates of poverty for each tile derived from satellite imagery. In order to select the poorest cantons, we then aggregate together these really granular estimates at the canton level. Again, cantons are somewhat equivalent to counties in Togo, and identified the 100 poorest cantons in Togo in which to distribute aid. So that was step one. Once the 100 poorest cantons were selected, it was clear that there still wasn't enough budget to pay every individual in those poorest cantons for NoVC aid. And so we went on to selecting individual beneficiaries, and that was done via mobile phone data. The intuition here is somewhat similar to the satellite piece. We, through Minister Lawson and the collaboration with the mobile network operators, we had access to all the mobile network data in Togo from Togo's 2 mobile network operators for about 6 months prior to the program. And this contains metadata on the mobile network transactions taking place. So for each call and text on the network, we observe something like the unique ID for the caller and the recipient, the date, time, and duration of the call, and then we observe the cell tower off of which the call is pings when it's placed, which gives us some measure of geography. We also observe information about mobile money transactions and mobile data usage. And again, like the satellite imagery, this is really rich and very large data, and the question is how to extract information from that that's predictive of poverty. I think it might be fairly intuitive to people to imagine that there is information in that data that's predictive of poverty. The sort of key intuition here is that people who are wealthy use their phones differently than people who are poor. They might make more transactions, use more mobile money, make more international calls, or use more mobile data. And so in order to access that really rich information on poverty from the phone data, we calculate about 1,000 statistics from all of the underlying mobile network data for each subscriber that describe the way they use their phone, things like the things I mentioned before, the number of days that they use their phone in the time period, the number of calls they're making, how much mobile data they're using, and more. As in the satellite imagery case, the challenge is just how to use all that really rich data to predict a single poverty score or poverty prediction. And again, we use supervised learning algorithms to generate poverty scores from the mobile network data. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the actual process, but if you're interested, feel free to ask about it in the Q&A. To validate those predictions, we conducted a phone survey in Togo in September 2020, where we gathered ground truth data on poverty. So for those 10,000 subscribers who we interviewed, we collected informed consent to match their survey responses, where we gathered ground truth poverty information, to their phone data from which we generated the poverty prediction. And then we can compare how accurately the phone data predicts poverty. We have actually done this exercise in Togo in September 2020 for the purpose of the Novisi transfers, but also across a variety of other contexts for research projects. And across these contexts, we see that the phone-based poverty estimates are explaining between 1/4 and half of the variation in ground truth measures of poverty. So that's how we identified, or how we created poverty scores for every mobile phone subscriber in Togo, but then we had to actually use them for targeting aid. And so sort of our key results in this project were comparing how accurately one could target aid based on these phone-based poverty scores in comparison to alternative methods the government could have adopted for targeting no-VC transfers. And in particular, we compare the phone-based targeting approach to the occupation-based targeting approach that the government had originally taken in cities, so looking at how well that approach would have scaled to rural areas. Geographic targeting, so just paying everybody who's living in like the poorest of the poorest cantons. So those two approaches would have been feasible, like the government could have adopted them instead of the phone-based targeting approach for no-VC targeting in rural areas. We also look at two approaches that were not feasible. In particular, an asset-based wealth index and a proxy means test, both of which require going in person and collecting ground truth poverty data on all the potential beneficiaries for a program. So Togo didn't have up-to-date comprehensive poverty data that they could have used to build one of these wealth indices, but perhaps in the future that might become feasible. So we thought it was worth comparing the phone-based approach to those as well. Before I jump into the results, we compare these approaches in two different contexts. First, we use our phone survey that we conducted in September 2020 in the poorest 100 cantons of Togo to evaluate how well these different approaches would have or did work in the case of the phone-based targeting approach for the rural no-VC transfers. We also use a survey, a nationally representative survey that was conducted in the field in 2018 pre-COVID to evaluate how well these different approaches would scale to a full national program. For each of these, we look at precision and recall for reaching the poorest 29% of people in the first plot on the left for the 100 poorest cantons and the plot on the right. Nationally, we focus on 29% because that's how much budget the rural no-VC program had to pay people. We were able to pay 29% of the residents in those areas. And then we also look at an AUC score. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these metrics, but I can in the Q&A if people have questions. Something to keep in the back of your mind is just that basically for all of these metrics, higher is better. And on these bar graphs, for each bar on the left, I'm showing precision and recall. On the right, I'm showing AUC score. Higher is better. So jumping into the results here, on the left graph, we're focusing in on the 100 poorest cantons of Togo, so focusing on simulating the rural no-VC transfers that were given out and how accurately those were targeted. And sort of the key result that you can see from this graph is that the occupation and geographic targeting approaches, which are shown in red, by both metrics are not as accurate as the phone-based targeting approach, which is shown in green. And then moving to the right graph, looking at the national program where we have a bit more data and can therefore simulate a few other targeting approaches, the left two sets of bars, again shown in red, are occupation and geographic targeting, are looking still a little weaker than the phone-based approach. And then the approaches based on comprehensive poverty data in something like a social registry, which are shown in blue on the right side of the graph, are clearly a little better than the phone-based approach. So this is kind of the key result from our research, is that it looks like the phone-based approach is better than these sort of basic decision rules based on occupation or geography, but is not as strong as if we'd been able to go and collect good poverty data on everybody who applied for the program. To me, that's a fairly intuitive result. All right, before I wrap up, I wanted to discuss a few other policy considerations in thinking about using digital data to target cash transfers that might be worth considering before policymakers sort of replicate these types of strategies in other contexts. The first is digital exclusion. So this is a more general concern about programs that are not only use mobile phone data for targeting, but are run over the phone. A concern is that people who don't own phones might be the poorest or most vulnerable, and they might not have access to the aid. I should say that the NoVC program was tied to SIM cards and not mobile phones. So in theory, someone who didn't own a phone could buy just a SIM card and use someone else's phone to register themselves for the aid program. So they did try to address this exclusion as best they could under the circumstances. But it's worth noting that in Togo, about 65% of individuals own a phone. And when we look at just rural areas, that goes down to about 43%. So phone ownership is going to continue to be a major factor in all of these programs going forward. Though I should say that the data that we're using to calculate these statistics was survey data collected in 2018. And so it's possible and likely that phone ownership has increased since then and will continue to increase. Privacy is also a concern. Phone data contains private and potentially sensitive information. In our particular project, we focused a lot on data minimization, so making sure that no one of the collaborators in the project had access to all the data. And in particular, only our research team ever worked with the raw phone data. But I can talk more about that if you're interested in the Q&A. Likewise, fairness and bias are a concern. Recent work has shown how algorithms, if we're not careful in how we use them, can be biased against vulnerable subgroups. We look at that in great empirical detail in the paper. So if you're interested, check it out. I'll provide a link to the paper as soon as I'm done in just a second. A few other concerns are algorithmic transparency, as Minister Lawson mentioned, the sort of nuts and bolts of data sharing with mobile phone operators and data access, and then lastly, the increasingly technocratic approaches to targeting aid and making sure that those don't adversely affect the power dynamics between aid program implementers and beneficiaries. All right, I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up with just a few high-level takeaways. The first is that we show that satellite imagery and machine learning can be used to prioritize geographies for aid. We show that phone data can be used to prioritize individuals for aid. And we showed that the phone-based approach was more accurate than geographic or occupation-based targeting, but less accurate than an approach you could take if you could go into the field and collect good data on poverty at an individual level. On the last slide, I highlighted some of the challenges for machine learning and digital data and social protection that will continue to be policy relevant going forward. I just wanted to close by noting that this was not just a research exercise. The Rural NoVC or Give Directly NoVC program provided 5 months of support to close to 140,000 beneficiaries. So this was also a major real world undertaking that helped a lot of people. All right, I'm going to stop talking and take a couple questions. I'll put the links, or I don't know if I can actually access the chat as a panelist, but here are a couple links to relevant papers. In particular, the paper on top is our paper describing the work we did on targeting NoVC aid in Togo. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. All right, I think we're going to take a few questions now.
Yeah, so I've had a chance to read the questions. Maybe I'll start by answering the question from Matt, Emily, while you can read the questions from Veronica and Layla and decide if you want to answer them, or I'm happy to as well. So Matt asked this question about sort of general equilibrium effects of a large cash transfer program, and in particular, the potential that that could create inflation. So let me answer that in two ways. First about NoVC and then second in general. I think in the NoVC program, we didn't see evidence of inflation. To be honest, we weren't closely monitoring prices. The design of the program was such that it wouldn't be a first order concern because at least the second phase of NoVC that we were involved in provided transfers to 140,000 rural individuals out of a total rural population of about 4.5 million. So it was a really relatively small footprint program. It was also distributed over roughly 1/3 of the country geographically. And finally, it was also, these were meant to be subsistence transfers, about half of the minimum wage, like the living wage in Togo. More generally, I think it is an important concern, and it's a topic that more research is needed on. Ted Miguel, SIGA faculty director and co-authors have a recent paper that looks at this in the Kenyan context, also with Give Directly, a much larger cash transfer program. And it's encouraging that they don't see, they did monitor prices more carefully, and they don't see much evidence of that. But I think in general, it is something that is something to monitor. Emily, do you want to talk about Veronica or Layla, or do you want me to?
I can answer Veronica's question. Yeah, so I touched on this very briefly. The question is whether, in context where you could collect the data necessary for a proxy means test, whether the phone-based targeting approaches would still be a good idea, or whether we should just turn to the proxy means test. I think our results pretty clearly show that in the Togolese context, it looks like the proxy means test is significantly stronger than the phone-based approach. Though I think it's really important to note that that sort of assumes a perfectly calibrated proxy means test. In our research, we use a proxy means test that was collected in the same survey that we're using for evaluation, so it's well calibrated and up to date. I think a really interesting open research question is like, it's likely that proxy means tests sort of degrade over time. If we collect a proxy means test 5 years ago for every individual and then use that to target aid, 5 years later, it's likely that that proxy means test has to some extent gone out of date. And so it's possible that like up-to-date phone data that you might be able to access in real time might be more accurate than an out-of-date proxy means test. There is absolutely no evidence that I'm aware of that answers that question yet, but I think it's a really interesting open research question, and perhaps like the direction that this work should perhaps pursue is like starting to look at these temporal changes and seeing if phone data can help like fill the gaps. I don't know if I have time to do another question. I don't want to get into the way of the next panelist, so perhaps
I can answer it very briefly, which is to say the link that Emily posted to the paper on inferring wealth estimates from satellite imagery has a lot of the details. The short answer is it's very complicated. It's much more than just roofing material. There are literally thousands of different features derived from satellite imagery that end up playing a role in the predictions of the model.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, Josh, for answering these questions. We're going to be moving on to our next presenter. So next up, we have Simon Quinn. Simon is an associate professor of economics and deputy director of the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. He studies the role of firms in economic development with a focus on low and middle income countries, mostly in Africa and South Asia. Today, Simon is going to present his work on targeting a job intervention for Syrian refugees. So again, please put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and please go ahead, Simon.
Thank you very much. Let me just start by checking that you can hear me okay. Is this okay? Great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Presenting results from recent work that we conducted in Jordan on an adaptive targeted field experiment. As you can see, this is joint work with my co-authors Stefano Currier, Grant Gordon, Max Casey, Sohar Shami, and Alex Tatelboim. The basic idea of this research is really very simple. Most programs that we can think about, whether we think about government programs or research programs, assign people to different policies or different treatments in fixed proportions, and then one hopes compare their outcomes later. This approach is ideal if our objective is measurement, but it's not ideal for participant well-being. And in this project, we pursue a simple idea, which is that when participants are sampled over time, we can use information about the outcomes of the earlier cohorts in order to try to optimize treatment assignment for later cohorts. We think that this is an exciting innovation to take this kind of idea to the field. This idea, let me emphasize, is not ours. It's been around for many decades, but there's a novelty in taking this to the field with a relevant population. We think that this approach may be particularly valuable for targeting of aid. First, as we take experiments to vulnerable populations more and more. And second, as the scale and scope of experiments is growing. We could think of all manner of important have been already in this session that fit into this category. Put differently, I know that, for example, when I started learning about randomized controlled trials, there was a simple mantra that I often heard, which is first find out what works. And traditionally, we have often felt as researchers that there is a bright line that divides the research phase of a project, which would typically be, in many cases, a fixed proportion randomized controlled trial, from the policy implementation phase. I really love the previous project that we heard about because I think it shows just a fascinating example of how we can break down that bright line distinction. We think that this project is another example where we do that. So specifically what we do in this project is that we test 3 different job search support interventions, and they respectively provide the following. First, we provide cash in order to help refugees to search for work. Second, we provide information on how to approach the labor market. And third, we provide some behavioral support, some nudges, if you like, to address potential self-control problems. We implement these in an experimental context in Jordan. We do this with a sample that includes both Syrian refugees and also vulnerable Jordanians, and we implement in partnership with the International Rescue Committee, a large NGO. What do we find? After 6 weeks, we find very small impacts on employment. As I'll explain, our algorithm increases impacts by about 1 percentage point through its targeted nature. Second, when we come back slightly later with a slightly different interview method, we find large impacts of the cash grant on both refugee employment as well as on job retention and earnings. We think that this is interesting in terms of speaking about the role of cash in helping refugees to search for work. There's a key caveat here, of course, which is that this is still quite a short time frame. Now, the impacts of the other interventions are more short-lived, and we find no impacts on Jordanians. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our 3 treatments. To that, we'll add a typical standard control group, and then we'll talk about the experiment. So for the first treatment that we try involves cash. There's a basic idea here. Job search can be costly, and indeed there's a growing body of empirical evidence that suggests that financial resources can help to activate job seekers. So here we offer an unconditional cash transfer to the value of about $90 US at the time of writing. And what this would do is it would allow the average job seeker in our sample, if they wanted to double their search expenditure for 9 weeks. It does not require to be spent on search, but it would allow that kind of magnitude if they wanted to. So it's quite a substantial transfer relative to the expenditure that we see beforehand or in the control group on job search activities. Second, we think about a treatment that involves information. The basic motivation here is that for many Syrian refugees, there's very little exposure previously to the formal labor market in Jordan. So we try to fill, if you like, an information gap. This is based on work that several co-authors and I have done previously in Ethiopia, which suggests that provision of information about the search process, encouraging people to, for example, do better at preparing CVs or approaching interview processes can be useful to help people to signal their skills. Third, we provide behavioral support in the form of a job search planning session where participants are given a job search calendar and SMS reminders to help people to reach search goals. This too is based on other recent results in the literature. We sample study participants continuously from February 2019 to November 2019. We're looking at people here who are aged between 18 and 45 years of age. And they had to be willing to take up a new low-skilled wage job in the immediate future. We measure wage employment with a short phone call 6 weeks after intake. This is the measure that we use in order to run the adaptive algorithm I'll tell you about in a moment. And then we have full follow-up surveys 2 and 4 months after the intake. Excuse me. Now, as I alluded to earlier, what we're trying to do in this experiment is really 2 things. First, we want to learn about the potential outcomes of individuals in each treatment group. And this, of course, is what we might think of, as I explained earlier, as a very traditional kind of idea for an RCT design. But second, we also want to maximize the outcomes of study participants. We're dealing here with about 3,700 respondents, and these are respondent populations that are of obvious and immediate relevance for policy design. Now, let me insist on just one equation in my presentation. The basic idea is this. At each time point, we're going to assign individuals with some probability, P, and that probability is going to be given as 5% plus 80% times the probability our model that our model says that a particular treatment is best for this stratum. I'll talk about strata in a moment. We basically have a model that looks at data that has been collected from the experiment to date and forms a belief, formally a well-defined Bayesian posterior belief, that tells us the probability that each of the 4 treatments is optimal for that particular individual who's just walked through the door. So if the model thinks that a particular treatment is more likely to be optimal, then it assigns more weight to that particular treatment relative to the others. And this is essentially a modified version of a very famous algorithm known as Thompson's algorithm, which has been around since 1933. Let's look at the impacts on our 6-week employment. Now, 6-week employment rates here are not affected by the interventions, as I mentioned earlier. So here, what we see, for example, is all participants, and we have outcomes from the control group, the behavioral nudge intervention, the information treatment, and the cash treatment. We see that these are not significantly different for each other, either in the whole sample or for the Syrian subsample. And therefore, we conclude that at least at the 6-week mark, none of the treatments seem to have an effect. This then is reflected in the following figure, what this figure shows is the assignment probability that the algorithm is using at each week of the experiment. So as alluded to, we start the experiment, we have equal mass of 25% on each of the 4 treatments. Once we get about 8 weeks into the experiment, we've now collected the 6-week follow-up data from the initial respondents, and we start allowing the algorithm to form this belief about the effectiveness of different treatments. So you will see, if I can give a slightly human twist to an algorithm's reasoning, you will see that early on in the experiment, the initial data that came in suggested that actually the nudge intervention was doing very well. So you could think of this almost as a kind of optimism on the part of the algorithm here. The initial results seem to indicate high success to the nudge intervention. And accordingly, the algorithm placed more people into that treatment. That's why you see the green line jump up here. Over time, as more data comes in, the algorithm effectively sobers up. It learns that that initial optimism was actually just driven by luck, a sampling variation, if you like. And over time, these probabilities tend back towards 25%. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we actually didn't assign everybody with equal probabilities. We looked at 4 different binary features, which together define 16 strata. And this allows us not just to adapt over time, but also to have some element of targeting in the sense of allowing the possibility that some policies are better for some groups and some for others, that we do not have to have one size fitting all. So the 4 binary features are nationality, a dummy for whether the respondent identifies as being female, a dummy for education level, and a dummy for having relevant experience in wage employment. We put these together to form 16 strata. And we do find some interesting heterogeneity at the level of the strata. So for example, among Syrian men with more education who have never yet had a job, we find that cash is the most effective intervention. Among, for example, Jordanian women with less than high school education who've never had a job, cash is the least effective. Now, just to be clear, I'm not making a strong statement about this. I'm not claiming that within each of these 16 strata that we could, for example, formally reject a null hypothesis. But what we can do is we can say, did we gain anything from the fact that our algorithm assigned different probability masses across these different strata? And the answer is yes, with some moderate gains from targeting. So we've got about a 1 percentage point increase in the probability of employment arising from the fact that our algorithm did not impose, as it were, one size fits all. When we then come back after 2 months and after 4 months, we get some interesting results starting to emerge about the role of cash. So here at this point, we find that cash helps Syrian refugees to find jobs. And to put that in tangible terms, at the 4-month mark, we increase employment from about 5% to about 9%. So given our sample size and our design, we're talking about another 40 jobs that were created as a result of this cash intervention, which is a small number, of course, in the aggregate, but for a population that is struggling to find these kind of wage jobs, we think it's non-negligible. This is consistent with other aspects of our data in interesting ways. First, if you look about the Syrians in the control group, you'll see that those who have more cash on hand are already searching more. That's not a causal claim, but it's consistent with what we see from our experimental results. First, if you look at individuals who are short of cash at baseline, you will see that the impacts of the cash intervention are more effective for them. We get additional impacts on retention and hourly wages. We also went and did some elicitation of prior beliefs and some qualitative work, both from IRC experts and indeed qualitative work from our respondents. Interestingly enough, the message that we were consistently getting from both groups was a prediction that cash was likely to be the most effective. And finally, if you look at other interesting recent literature concerning refugees, you'll in many cases find a very similar narrative emerging. Now, I showed you earlier on a graph that had the different probabilities of assignment to different treatment. And I showed you that given the measure that we used, which is to say whether somebody is employed at the 6-week mark, that we did not find sustained movement away from that equal probability 25% mark. We can then go back and say, well, it's interesting because we do seem to find an effect when we come back at the 2-month mark. And in particular, when we come back at the 2-month follow-up mark with a full survey with an enumerator who is known to and trusted by the respondent, people seem to be more willing to tell us about their employment in a way that maybe seems perhaps more reliable, especially about semi-formal jobs than what we were told at the 6-week mark. So we can go back in a counterfactual way and simulate what do we think our algorithm would have done had we targeted 2-month employment rather than targeting 6-week employment. And here you can look at the proportion who are assigned to the best treatment. The best treatment here meaning not cash, but rather the best treatment on a strata by stratum basis. And essentially what you'll find is that had we targeted that 2-month employment rather than 6-week employment, something that we unfortunately had no way of knowing about in advance, that there you actually would have seen a sustained departure. By week 40 of the experiment, you would be putting something in the order of 45% of people into the treatment that seems optimal for their stratum. So this is not what we did, but we think it's an important insight for the potential practical design of these kind of experiments moving forward. So what have we done in this presentation? I present new experimental evidence on the impacts of job search assistance for Syrian refugees in Jordan. Our results, as you saw, suggest that liquidity constraints may be a key barrier to labour market participation. Put bluntly, that giving people more cash allows them to search more effectively, but also highlights some important potential points for design of adaptive experiments in future. First, that there seems to be important room for adaptive targeting because interventions can have very different impacts on different groups. But second, that we need good short-term proxies of welfare. So in this case, we used short-term employment effects, which seems like a reasonable proxy, but certainly not ideal. And as I emphasized, with the benefit of hindsight and with a clear view to future design of experiments, we wish in this case that we had used an in-person 2-month follow-up rather than the phone-based 6-week follow-up. We're excited about this work, and above all, we're excited about the possibility for these kind of algorithms to simultaneously allow a more nuanced adaptation over time and a more nuanced assignment of different policies to different subgroups. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the interest in our work, and I'll be more than happy to discuss further. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. I think we have 1 or 2 questions which maybe we can take briefly. The first one is about power calculations and how one would do power calculations for this type of study, I guess, in which you are modifying the ratio between groups as the study progresses.
Right. I think the right way to do it, and indeed the way that we did it, is essentially by power simulations. So we've got an algorithm. It's a well-designed or well-defined algorithm a priori. Yes, it's true that you don't know in advance what probability of assignment will be, but you can essentially simulate and then look at the probability that the posterior exceeds some threshold. To really get into the weeds, what we do in the paper is a combination of Bayesian inference, but also randomization inference. Let us not go down that path in detail. It's all explained in the paper. But I think that would be the practical answer on power calculations, is that you would simulate based on the kind of parameter magnitudes that you would be interested in.
Great, thanks. And then there's one quick question about how to control for attrition in the study. If you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I guess attrition is an enemy of every applied researcher in every context, right? So, we do the usual kind of things, which is that we're going to try hard to go back to the respondent population, try to make sure we've got multiple phone numbers for them, which we collect with their permission at baseline, and do our very best to reach people. But I agree that, as in any applied context, that if you've got high attrition, and particularly attrition that will correlate with treatment, then that's going to affect your estimation of impacts, and potentially that would mess up an adaptive design like this in the same way that it would mess up and adaptive design in any context. Our sense here is that our attrition is relatively low, and that it doesn't seem to affect the results, but I completely agree it's an important issue for really any study, I guess.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for taking the time to answer those and for your presentation. So we'll be moving now to the last talk of our first session, which is called Targeting for Impact versus Deprivation in Kenya. This will be put forward by Ted Miguel and Michael Walker, who will co-present. Ted is the Oxfam Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at Berkeley and faculty co-director of SIGA. He studies African economic development, including work on the economic causes and consequences of violence, the impact of ethnic divisions on local collective action, interactions between health, education, environment, and productivity for the poor, and methods for transparency in social science research. Michael Walker is a postdoc at SIGA with a focus on development economics, and his work consists of field experiments in Kenya. His current projects include studies on the effects of cash transfers on a broad range of outcomes, including public goods, and on the long-term effects of child health interventions. Ted and Michael, you can take it away.
Hey, everybody. It's so great to be here and just really delighted to hear these talks, which really speak to each other. I'll be starting off the presentation here, and then my co-author, Michael Walker, will continue. And this is joint work with several others, Johannes Haushofer, Carlos Paramo, and Paul Niehaus. So, we'll be focusing on targeting here, which has been the theme so far today. As you've heard already, targeting is critical to the design of many different types of programs, anti-poverty programs, labor market programs, as in the Jordan project that Simon just discussed. In most anti-poverty programs, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis on trying to identify the poorest, the most deprived, along some metric. That's very much, I think, the thrust of some of the work in Togo and really just many other programs. And as we heard in Emily's talk, there's really a range of ways of trying to identify these poorest households, sometimes through proxy means tests, sometimes now through new methods, using satellite data or cell phone data. The ability to define poverty and identify the poor has actually been a big advance of development economics over the past few decades. When you step back a bit, though, and think about how to design programs in some sort of optimal way, or the best possible way, targeting on deprivation is really only one piece of the puzzle, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. And I think even in Simon's talk a minute ago, we got a sense of that there may be different effects of programs on different subgroups. There could be heterogeneous effects, and actually more and more research in development economics is indicating that different types of people and populations experience programs in different ways. And the question that's going to be really central in our case is the possibility that maybe the people who are the most deprived, maybe the poorest of the poor, may not be those who experience the largest treatment effects. They may or may not. That's something we're going to be interested in investigating, and we'll show you results on. It could be the case that the poorest of the poor lack some of the inputs, the opportunities, maybe the education or the skills to do the most with some assistance. And maybe some other groups have other opportunities that allow them to do more. This is something that is going to be very important for optimal design. The way economists sometimes think about program design is through the lens of what's called the social planner, a sort of benevolent policymaker who's looking at all the data and just trying to improve lives the most for the most people. So we're going to kind of take that lens in our approach here, and ask the question, what if the social planner faces this kind of trade-off? What should they do? In particular, we're going to be focused on a cash transfer program. So there's going to be some commonalities with what Minister Lawson, Josh, and Emily were talking about before. We're actually, in this setting, working with the NGO Give Directly on a very large scale cash transfer program in Kenya. And in fact, it's the one that Josh alluded to in response to Matt Chanoff's question earlier on. In the realm of cash transfers, this possible trade-off, this possibility that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the effects of the program are real. They're quite important. Different households or individuals may have different returns on investment. They may have different opportunities. As Simon mentioned in the case of Jordan, maybe even giving people cash could affect their job search behavior. And maybe different subgroups have different opportunities, maybe due to labor market discrimination or other factors. For all these reasons, different households could do very different things with cash. Think of the starkest comparison. Imagine there's some households that get the cash transfer and pretty much spend it all right away on food or other necessities. Very useful and important things for them to do, for sure. But then there's other households that get the cash and invest in a business or use the cash to help them with job search and then land a better job. That second type of household may use the cash to generate a stream of higher income going forward in the future that could lead to much improved living standards even long after the cash has been received. So when we have that, these two types of households, we may actually experience very different impacts of the program. And so our empirical question, what we're going to ask the data to help us answer is there a trade-off? Is it the case that the poorest households, those we identify as poorest, have larger or smaller or the same sorts of impacts as the less deprived households? Now, this slide, I'm not going to get to it, in too much detail. For the research economists, this will be something people are familiar with. But let me just give the intuition behind these two equations, because they're going to be central to what we do. The first equation is the standard way economists talk about the social planner as adding up or summing up the welfare across all households in the population, caring about the measurement of some outcome Y, let's say a living standards measurement, like how much they consume or what they earn. The second equation expands on this idea to highlight the two terms I was just talking about. There's that dark blue Y term in the expression, which is what people's living standards would look like in the absence of an intervention, really how deprived they are, how poor they are. And then there's that light blue triangle or delta, which is the measurement of how much they gain from the treatment, the impact of the treatment. And for a kind of general social planner or someone trying to optimize the design of a program, there could be a tension between targeting those with, that dark blue Y term being low, really targeting the most deprived, or targeting those with the large light blue delta. And that's really the central point of what we're going to do. And in a couple minutes, Michael Walker is going to talk about how we use really extensive data and machine learning methods to try to estimate these terms in a whole population. So what is the setting that we study? As I mentioned, we're working in Kenya and in a part of rural Western Kenya here highlighted in green. We're working with the NGO Give Directly that provides large-scale cash transfers to households. And we worked in a quite large study area of over 650 villages. And actually the study area we work in has about 300,000 people. So it's a pretty meaningful scale. Households in this area, in this rural area, are almost all working in agriculture, but there's a range of other economic activities that they're working in. Many are self-employed, many are working for wages, sometimes seasonally, and living standards are quite low in general. And so, again, there is variation in opportunities and economic realities facing different households that could affect how they use a cash transfer. The way Give Directly operates is they use a very simple proxy means test, basically if households have a grass thatched roof as a proxy for poverty. That's how they target the cash, and they target it to about 35 or 40% of the population in this area. The cash is unconditional and it's a large transfer, and in sort of what's called PPP terms, accounting for price differences across settings, it's worth about $1,800 US. That's a very meaningful transfer for these households. On average, it's about 3/4 of average household income. So again, imagine a really large cash transfer coming into pretty poor households And then what we're going to do is measure basically what do they do with this money and how much does this money improve their living standards over the next couple years? And is there the trade-off I mentioned before? So for all of the cool technical detail and all the results, let me turn it over to my co-author and fellow NCEGA colleague, Michael Walker.
Great, thanks, Ted. So as part of this project, we surveyed thousands of households before and after they received transfers. So we use baseline pre-treatment data as inputs, also known as features, into our predictions. And so for this exercise, we restrict attention to 16 proxy means test-like covariates. And so these are variables that are easily collectible and in line with variables that are commonly used by policymakers around the world. These are things like asset ownership, household demographics, and economic activities like self-employment. And so the goal of this exercise was to conduct something similar to what a policymaker could feasibly conduct with these methods. And so for today's talk, I'm going to focus on 3 out of our 4 pre-specified primary outcomes of policy interests. And these are all measured as part of our inline surveys after transfers. This is consumption expenditures, assets, and income. And each of these are broad financial measures of living standards, and they're the types of outcomes that are frequently targeted by poverty alleviation programs. So the timing of our inline surveys was on average a year and a half after a household first received a cash transfer. The cash transfers went out over the course of 8 months. Our inline surveys range between 9 and 31 months. So this is a key point for interpretation. It means that we're capturing kind of these short to medium run effects, but not immediate effects after the program went out. And so we don't have the data on the period when the transfers are going out. And this may matter, especially for our interpretation of consumption results, which is a point I'll come back to. But this does measure whether or not there is some persistence for these gains, for these outcomes, and that may be a really important consideration for policymakers. And so we define deprivation for these outcomes on a per capita basis. So we divide by the number of people within the household for looking at that, given that the resources needed to support a household of 4 members is going to be different than that you need to support for 2 members. That said, when we look at impact, we're doing that at the household level, as all households receive the same amount of transfer, regardless of size. This means that $1 in transfers in maps to $1 in impact. So to generate these predictions, we use our baseline data to generate predictions for the inline deprivation and predicted treatment effects at an individual level. So machine learning methods are especially well suited to prediction, and we use a method known as generalized random forests. This is a method that is good at identifying heterogeneity in treatment effects while attempting to avoid overfitting, or to kind of really load up on factors that maybe matter for this one particular sample, but may not generalize as well. So I'm not going to go into too much technical details given the time of this talk, but I'm happy to answer other questions around these methods in the Q&A if folks are interested. So in contrast to some other targeting exercises, which use contemporaneous data to predict deprivation, a nice feature of this project is that we are actually being able to use baseline data to predict outcomes about a year and a half later. So this gives a nice parallel structure to our need for generating predictions for both deprivation and impact. So once we have these individual level predictions to classify households as most deprived, we look at the bottom 50% of an outcome of interest. And for the most impacted, we look at the top 50% of treatment effects. And this is all among our sample of a little under 5,000 program eligible households. So given that about 35 to 40% of households were eligible for treatment, this is broadly looking at about the kind of bottom 20% of households overall in this study area. So to quickly fix some ideas related to the trade-offs that we might see, here we're kind of graphically presenting the trade-off that Ted had verbalized before. So along the horizontal axis, we have deprivation, and along the vertical axis, we have a predicted impact. And so households that are further to the left of the axis are those that are going to be more deprived as they have lower inline values of these things. And then households higher on the vertical axis are the ones that have higher treatment data or higher treatment effects. So this is all fake data. These are not our actual results. But to illustrate, in this figure here, we see that there's no trade-off between targeting impact versus deprivation. So households in the upper left are those that are the most deprived, but they're also the ones that have the highest treatment effects. So a planner would definitely want to target these households. And so the key takeaway here is if we see this sort of downward sloping relationship, that's indicative of no trade-off or tension between the two objectives that we've kind of going through here. So 2 more kind of simulated data examples just to fix ideas. In the left figure here, this is a case where the less deprived gain the most. So here we see an upward sloping relationship. And so in this case, we're then kind of finding that there is going to be a trade-off because the people that are least deprived are the ones that are gaining the most. And then on the right-hand side, here we're looking at a case where there's kind of treatment effect heterogeneity, but it's unrelated to deprivation. So there's no systematic relationship across the distribution, but if you can figure out how to identify some of these like kind of high impact households, you may still be able to kind of improve your targeting in a positive, in a social welfare sense. Okay, so moving forward to what we're actually finding results in now, this is using real data. So here on the left-hand side, this is plotting things, in the same way as our figures before for our consumption. So this is looking at inline per capita consumption on the horizontal axis and predicted treatment effects on the vertical axis. So each individual point here is a household, and they've been color coded so that yellow is going to be those that are most deprived and most impacted. These are, again, the households that have no trade-off. Blue is the households that are most deprived only. Green are those that are most impacted only, and the pink are neither kind of deprived nor the most impacted. So there's a couple things to note here. So first, as we note on the scale of the y-axis, we're predicting positive treatment effects across the whole x-axis. So households that are positively benefiting from the program, even at low levels of deprivation. That said, we do see a positive slope so that households that are predicted to be less deprived at inline are in fact the ones that are benefiting more. So whereas the most deprived are gaining about $200 in annual consumption about 1.5 years later, after the least deprived are gaining more around $300. So the fact that we do see a lot of these green households in the upper right-hand corner indicates that there will be a trade-off here. Panel B is showing the same thing, but in terms of percentiles or the cumulative distribution functions. And again, we see that there's a large mass of people in the bottom right and in the top left. So again, this is also indicative of a trade-off. So here we're now presenting all of our outcomes together. So this is consumption, which is the same as the last slide, assets and income. And then here, the key takeaway is we don't see a clear downward sloping relationship for any of these. In fact, it seems like there's a fair amount of variation in treatment effects. So there are kind of a lot of kind of high impact households, especially that at lower levels of deprivation. And if anything, we're sort of seeing some upward sloping relationship, especially for assets, where income is a little bit flatter. So kind of taken together, this is really suggestive that there is going to be some sort of trade-off that policymakers need to think about when deciding whether not to target on deprivation or impact in this setting. Interestingly, when we look at the correlations and predicted treatment effects across outcomes, we're finding a positive correlation. And so what this means is that those that see the largest gains in one outcome are also seeing the largest gains in others. And so this is different than the case that if we were finding that some households were investing all their transfers and other households were spending all their transfers, as that would lead to a negative correlation between consumption and assets. And so what are kind of some of the characteristics and features of the households that are most impacted versus those that are most deprived? For both impact and deprivation, household size turns out to matter a lot. And so when we look at impact, it's larger households and households with more pre-existing assets and economic activity. So those that, for instance, were running a business prior to receiving the transfer, those are key predictors for having a high impact. Whilst for deprivation, these are smaller households, and whether or not there's a widow or an elderly household member is associated with being more deprived. So larger households have about one more person on average that is working in the household compared to the smaller ones. And so this is really kind of highlighting like the trade-off that we're thinking through here. So, again, if you're targeting for impact, you're looking at these larger households that maybe are able to kind of leverage their household members to generate greater economic activity. But at the same time, then you would be missing out on these households that are smaller and that have widows and elderly people within them, which are groups that we may really want to help. So I'm going to skip over some of this, but just this is the kind of getting into detail on the social welfare analysis that we're trying to do. Really, this is about trying to quantify the magnitude of this trade-off. And this is kind of we require a number of technical assumptions around this, including, we're really focused here on whether or not one person that is given an opportunity gets more of an outcome rather than whether or not they're given that opportunity, which may be something that we really want to think about just in terms of like expanding opportunities for everybody. So here we're really focused on outcomes. but we use a utility function known as constant relative risk aversion. There's a parameter there that winds up, indicating how curved that utility function is, and that really translates into like how redistributive do our preferences need to be in order to justify targeting the most deprived rather than the most impacted. And so the key takeaway here is that we require very, very redistributive preferences in order for the planner to prefer targeting the most deprived in this setup. So we wind up finding that you would need to be targeted. You need to kind of have redistributed preferences where that you would value someone that is twice as rich, more than at 1/36 of that relative to a poor household. And these were like very, very different than what we're kind of seeing in terms of typical row values in experiments conducted in Nairobi. So broadly, just kind of the punchline of all this is that as we do this analysis, we're finding that targeting aid to the poorest may not be welfare optimal. It really depends on the outcome of interest and the degree of redistributed preferences that one might have. And so it's important to think through how these results might generalize or their external validity. And so the study area that we're looking at is relatively ethnically and socially homogeneous, and it has less income inequality than other areas of, say, India or other contexts. And so that may be really important for thinking about how these results may generalize. This is also kind of in the context of a one size like large unconditional cash transfer, and we're looking at medium run outcomes here. Again, so that, and it doesn't mean that the most deprived don't benefit from these transfers, they do, but we find that in this context, the still relatively poor households that are slightly better off realize larger gains. And we think this is a really important trade-off to consider when we think through policy. And so it's also important to note that there's a lot of broader philosophical issues about fairness that our model doesn't fully address. So if we're thinking about that, one reason why households may not be able to translate transfers into impact is because of discrimination or bias in the labor market, one could still really want to prioritize these types of individuals. But we think it's important to kind of like highlight these trade-offs and to really push policymakers and aid organizations to think through their objectives, because in many cases, it seems like this assumption that the most deprived benefit the most is just kind of baked into the programs that they're running. And I think this also does raise a kind of a few more provocative questions we think are important to address. So as you've heard already, the cash transfers kind of continue to scale around the world, especially after COVID. The fact that we're finding high impacts among those that are a bit richer raises the question of how much we should be spending on resources to identify the poorest households versus more universal targeting, since these other households are seeming to benefit. And we also certainly don't want to say that we shouldn't be targeting the most deprived, but maybe alternative programs will work better for them, such as the kind of multifaceted targeting the ultra poor style programs that provide a wide variety of support. You could also think about maybe alternative transfer sizes or modalities or durations could be really useful here. So in general, this highlights the importance of evidence for informing policy design and the importance of focusing research attention on the most deprived. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Michael. We'll be happy to take questions in the Q&A if anybody has any additional ones. I think Ted is answering them in there as well. We have one from Madeline. Michael, if you can see that. I think you can take one question.
So this is for other types of social impacts. So in terms of how these were explained on the ground, so this was done by the NGO Give Directly, and so they would kind of come in and hold a community meeting in the communities that they were working. They were not explaining the kind of exact targeting role, but said that they were targeting for poor households within those. We've looked, as part of our other paper, we've looked at kind of the economic impacts across these communities, and we're actually finding kind of positive spillovers onto households that are ineligible and households in control villages. So it does seem that there are some kind of positive economic impacts on that side. And we don't find anything in terms of like negative psychological effects for households that were kind of missing out on these transfers. But it is important to kind of think through that in terms of the context.